Well, I'm going to narrate this video. Maybe, okay.
You can put the mic near this.
Yeah, it doesn't work. I've tried that before, but basically these are like badgers, and these badgers are kept in a pen, as we'll see in a second, and basically every time the groundskeeper tries to contain the badger manages to get out. And so we're going to see some stuff in a moment, but they unlock everything, they cannot be contained, they're always escaping. Since I have other videos, I am going to try to get the sound working. So just watch the badger for 1 second while we try to get the sound working.
It's really cute.
This is really a shame. See, they're all on here.
Wow.
Yeah, the badger is, cannot be
Wow,
locked
he's got
up.
hands kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Holy cow.
Oh man.
That's impressive.
Is the name? You know the name of the badger?
Did that happen?
They did a National Geographic spread on him.
That's
Oh, no.
awesome.
Yeah,
Wait,
he's
oh,
an
so
escape artist.
So it's this particular badger
Yes,
that can
it's a
get out of
particular
there.
badger, yeah.
Well, it's not any
They're probably
badger.
all crafty. I feel like
I
badgers.
think he's a
are
honey
crafty.
badger.
Yeah, honey badger.
Yeah. We know a lot about this badger.
Okay. Well, that's a hacker. A hacker can't be contained. They hate locks. They could break locks. They have to have freedom. And they kind of express this commitment in many different ways. And I think one of the important things when you are thinking about hackers is that they really don't come in the same shapes and sizes. There's many different ways to be a hacker, right? And so Tim was talking a little bit about open source software, and actually my first book was on free software. And these people are indeed a bit like addicts, but the addiction, unlike meth and morphine, actually leads to probably better things. And actually this book is actually going to come up in a little bit because one of the main topics in this book has to do with the connection between free speech and source code, which is something that's coming up with the Apple case right now. And in many ways, I don't think Apple could be making the arguments that they're making had hackers not made this connection. And so it'll come up in a little bit. So another topic I've worked quite a bit on is Anonymous, and that was a real trip to kind of dive into this world because they were very difficult to study because they're anonymous. And there's many interesting things about them, and some of them will come up a little bit later, but I actually think one of the most interesting things about them, just to connect it a little bit with Tim, is that they have an incredibly strong anti-celebrity ethic. It is extremely taboo to build up a name for yourself. You could only build up the brand of anonymous. And that probably is, I think, one of the most important contributions to that Anonymous provides, at least ethically. They also, I think, when it comes to journalism, have done some interesting things that will come up. So my own relationship to journalism has been really interesting. 4 or 5 years ago, I would say I didn't have a relationship that much to the world of journalism, but now I have many different relationships. So I write some op-eds from time to time, as I did here for Wired. I pitch stories to journalists, so that story up there is one I pitched to a New York Times reporter and landed on the front cover, and it has to do with an informant that was implanted in Anonymous, who was also requesting a lot of hacks from a hacker, so there's a big question, why was an informant requesting all these hacks? I also was interviewed by over 300 journalists in a 2-year period, which was really remarkable, and after a while, as an anthropologist, I actually started to study journalists. And I have one piece coming out about my interactions with journalism, how my views changed, and I also kind of give a diagnosis of the present. Because I think we're in very interesting times, because on the one hand, there is all this kind of diversity of media forms. There's a lot of skepticism of the CBS's and CNN's. It's an all-time low the American population has of these media forms, but Tim's absolutely right that there's competing forces, and it's not entirely clear. I mean, we know that the Facebooks will command the attention of individuals, but in terms of the different venues, will it be Vice, or CNN that kind of end up being dominant? I do a lot of consulting as well. for documentary films, for Vice, for TV shows, because of my work on hackers. So that's all I'm going to say about myself. Now I want to talk about hacking. What does this have to do with journalism? And actually it's pretty remarkable because there are so many different ways that hackers work in the journalistic field. And I'm going to go through a couple of them in a more general way, and then I'm going to dive into what I think are the more interesting parts of this relationship. So this is SB. I had dinner with him about 2 nights ago in San Francisco. He was someone I interviewed for my first book, and here he's kind of waxing poetically about what it's like to program in Python. And he's a really remarkable programmer who's worked in many different places, but he currently is at First Look Media at The Intercept, the outfit where Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras co-founded. And what he's doing, like many hackers in different news organizations, is he's building a tool for data scraping that kind of allows a different journalists to do new forms of analysis. And he's by no means unique. There's these type of hackers working in many different outfits. A lot of hackers are involved in encryption, right? Or creating tools that anonymize data. And this alone obviously contributes to the journalistic field in some pretty profound ways. There's many different tools. I'm just using this example, SecureDrop, that was first kind of built by Aaron Swartz, who's a very famous hacker, who unfortunately committed suicide in part after the US government was going after him quite aggressively for downloading a lot of journal articles. And this tool now has been taken up by different programmers, including an ex-hacker, Kevin Poulsen, and is now in pretty solid shape. And many different kind of journalistic outfits, from the CBC to the New Yorker, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah, uses SecureDrop, and it allows sources to securely drop information. So another kind of really important role has to do with the technologist and the advisor. So imagine you're a journalist and you have to report on the NSA leaks. There's a lot of very technical information. Or you're reporting on Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency. Well, you know what? You're going to get lost pretty quickly. So many different journalistic outfits are hiring a kind of technologist, either in-house or they use them as consultants to kind of help with parsing the data. And they are really important, not simply in the journalistic world, but in the NGO world. Many, many nonprofits are now hiring these staff technologists. This is Ashkan Soltani. I'm not sure he'd call himself a hacker, but he is a technologist who was working on behalf of the Washington Post and wrote a bunch of stories, or the Washington Post wrote a bunch of stories that led to a Pulitzer Prize. And he was part of the team that won this prize. So moving along, a lot of hackers consider themselves to be journalists as well. So this is a very famous hacker, Emmanuel Goldstein. That is his hacker handle, named after a character in George Orwell's 1984. And he's been publishing the Hacker Quarterly 2600 for a very, very long time now. And this is a zine that a lot of hackers read. There's a lot of news that they themselves create. And there's many such zines in the hacker world. But I think they're interesting for journalists, not because simply they publish a zine, because many different subcultural groups do this, but because of the legal cases that they get embroiled in that then do have major effects in the journalistic world. So we know that certain court cases in the United States and Canada and other places have major impact on what journalists can do. One of the most famous cases of the last century was New York Times versus Sullivan, and here it explains it quite nicely. The court held that the First Amendment protects the publication of all statements, even false ones, about the conduct of public officials, except when statements are made with actual malice. This is a very big deal. It's one of the reasons why the United States has some of the broadest free speech protections in the world, because in other countries this is definitely not the case, right? In the UK, I think in Canada, it's not quite as expansive. Well, if there's one group who has been involved in free speech cases, along with journalists, it's also been hackers. And in fact, Emmanuel Goldstein is one of these kind of key hackers. So there was a case that 2600 and Emmanuel was involved in concerning a trademark case where he had the domain fuckgeneralmotors.com. And General Motors, well, they weren't entirely too happy about it, and they considered this to be a trademark infringement. And the courts ruled in favor of 2600 because it was political speech, and because no one was kind of confused. The consumer, wasn't looking for, buying a car.
Are things like this just he was like, whatever, I just want to do this for fun, or was it something where General Motors had done or said something against this guy?
Yeah,
and
that's
this was a response, because I feel like in context it might be.
I don't know exactly for this case. I do think that it started initially with some critique of Ford, where hackers, like 2600 spelled Ford, F-R-O-D, and then from that something, ensued. But I'm not entirely sure with this case. I bet it is something that they originally published. I know the next case I'm going to talk about, I know a little bit better. But usually there's usually something that spurs it, as opposed to kind of like, let's just attack Ford in this case. So another one that really matters today has to do with the association between code and speech. And this is me at a protest in San Francisco when a bunch of hackers got into trouble because they released a piece of software called DCSS. And DCSS concerns a piece of, or an algorithm called CSS, which basically encrypts DVDs so that you could only play them on approved players. And so some hackers came around and said, well, you know what? I want to play my DVD that I bought on my Linux machine. So I'm going to write DCSS, which unlocks CSS, and then allows you to play that media. Well, that was illegal under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is a copyright act in the United States. And what happened was that a hacker in Norway got arrested, not under the DMCA, but under pressure from the US government and some corporations. And then a bunch of different individuals and organizations, including 2600, got sued because they posted DCSS, right? Now, prior to this case, there was another hacker, Daniel J. Bernstein. He's also a programmer and currently a computer science professor, who was the first one to establish that source code, the underlying directions of software, is speech. And what he did was he wrote a program called Snuffle. And Snuffle was illegal under a international treaty law that made encryption a munition, so you couldn't export it. And it was considered a munition because terrorists could use it. So this young hacker, at the time graduate student, actually sued the government. He sued the government. This was a very kind of proactive case, and he won. And that court case is the first court case that established code as speech. Now, this case where 2600 was sued, the courts did not establish that connection in this case. But the important point is that hackers are kind of fighting for that connection. So much so in the past that I don't think Apple today, who's sort of making a couple of arguments, but one argument that they're making is that if the government forces them to make a tool to bypass their system, which currently only allows you to put in 10 tries to get into your phone, they consider that to be compelled speech and in violation of the First Amendment. So it's interesting to think about how a contemporary case which circles around free speech in many ways would not be possible without hackers fighting for free speech rights when it comes to source code. So basically, hackers foster a really vibrant culture of civil liberties. And I think journalists and hackers probably are the two groups that are most important, and academics as well, who foster this culture of civil liberties, where there's these accentuated commitments to free speech, to anonymity, and they're not simply legal battles, but cultural battles. And one of the reasons why I like Anonymous is because I think they also contribute to this culture of civil liberties, and they do so both at the level of free speech as well as anonymity too. And so Anonymous is a name that's used for many different purposes, but nevertheless, they really kind of articulate that importance of anonymity through their symbols, through the fact that they're all masked, through the fact that they are actually engaging in political acts through anonymous channels. So I like this quote a lot. It's from Cass Sunstein, who's a professor at Harvard. And he mentions a well-functioning democracy is a culture of free speech, not simply legal protection of free speech. And again, if there's one kind of group that really supports this culture, I would say it's computer hackers. So now I'm going to return a little bit to journalism. I think this question of the culture of free speech is going to come up. But I'm going to go to a very particular case that I think really points to why it's so important that hackers are currently existing in the journalistic sphere. I'm going to show a very short segment of a clip. You don't really need the sound for this one. I'm sure most of you have seen it, and if you haven't, I'll explain what it is afterwards. So who here has seen Collateral Murder? Okay, so most people, but not all.